Hello, and welcome to AdvancingMentalHealth.org's video channel. I'm Jeff Baker. In this video segment, we'll be interviewing Lynn Juarez. Jamie's the author of the best-selling book Hope for Autism, and is also mother to a child with severe nonverbal autism. She's the founder of Hope Incorporated clinics and schools that have serviced thousands of people with autism around the world, and has developed a complete life-changing service model for families struggling with autism. Jamie is a licensed marriage and family therapist, did a PhD in psychology, and is a doctoral candidate in education. She also served on the Autism Alliance Task Force in the California State Legislature and helped write SB 946, the law that guarantees people with autism insurance coverage for behavioral therapy services. Jamie's story and struggles are very compelling, and we hope you find this interview as useful as we did. Welcome, Jamie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure, really. I wanted to start by asking you to take us from the time you were starting graduate school and what you were studying and leading up to the birth of your son.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I started graduate school in 1999. I was entering a program as a licensed marriage and family therapist with a specialty in applied behavioral analysis. It was a dual program that also offered a school counseling credential. I was having my now 19-year-old daughter back in 1999 and started, vivacious, excited. I was an inner city teacher in South Central LA, moved on to East LA, and life was ahead of me, and I was going to help change the world, and excited about learning the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and all of the different education codes that were going to help our students in the inner cities, along with allowing me the ability to ultimately start my own private practice one day, a mental health clinic or a school. Whatever my dreams were, I was going to fulfill them in 1999.
And then when was your son born?
So my second year in graduate school, I became pregnant again with my now 18-year-old son, Dominic, and was really excited to have him. I had my healthy little baby girl, second year of graduate school, and he was born.
And then prior to your son developing autism, what happened?
So my son was about 1.5 years, and he wasn't feeling very well, so we took him into the doctors to get checked out, and the doctors told us that he needed to be caught up on his vaccinations, that we were late for vaccinating him on schedule. So we listened to the doctors and vaccinated him. He had 6 vaccinations at that particular time, and I took my healthy son home that night, who ultimately developed 105 fever and seizures and became extremely sick, and took him back to the emergency room and asked the doctors, obviously very panicked and confused as to what was happening.
And then what ultimately happened in terms of, did he get better?
So my son did not get better. He remained very sick for months, lethargic. He just wasn't the same healthy little boy I had. And the sickness from the lethargy and the fevers and the seizures quickly turned into screaming, the most heart-wrenching scream that any mother would ever want to hear. He stopped sleeping, he stopped eating, he stopped looking at us and playing with his sister. The talking stopped. Everything just became, again, very confusing, and then behaviorally changed into these, now what we know are symptomology of autism. Language impairments, lack of eye contact, deficits in social reciprocity, oftentimes what we call in the field comorbidity, so additional diagnosis of, back then it's mental retardation that he was diagnosed with. That was our experience that happened around 2001.
When the behavioral changes started happening, what course of action did you take?
It was becoming quite evident to me that these were the symptoms of autism, and I demanded that I get an evaluation to rule it out. I was denied by the doctors, and I had to go through their formal appeals process, which I did, and won the appeal. And then we were introduced to a developmental team, which is comprised of a neurologist, a psychologist, and a therapist. And then at the end of it, they said they'd let us know, and it came back, autism.
So when that came, and the diagnosis, what was your first course of action?
My first course of action was obviously to trust my own field that I was in, and I extensively read the DSM that we were being trained on, and looking at the etymology or the cause of particular disorders and what the research was currently saying at the time in the year 2002. And there was no talk of any cause of autism, and that the rates had been gradually declining. So that was my first trigger in turning to the DSM and questioning not only the logistics behind how they were getting to these conclusions on disorders, but the why, the bigger picture behind the DSM. When was it developed? Who was it developed by? Where was the funding coming from? In some of our ethics class, that's the first thing they teach you, is when you look at the source to trust in science and medicine, the first thing you look at is who's funding those, and is there any bias? In mom mode, I started to question the DSM and in particularly the foundation of it and some of the statistics that were being reported within there, and more importantly, the solutions. How do I help him? And that led me into the only solution that they were pointing to, again, happened to be one of the certifications in my course was applied behavioral analysis, so a behavioral model. Speech therapy is also one of the evidence-based therapeutic services, and then you have occupational therapy. So when your child's diagnosed with autism, and this remains the same today, is those are the three essentially main categories that the DSM-driven diagnosis correlates to evidence-based practices, which is behavioral therapy, speech therapy, and occupational therapy. The now schools who are responsible for our children and providing those services and using the DSM, as well as the regional centers. So here in the state of California, we have regional centers that are social service programs that are in place to also help our children. And he was being denied everywhere services. So he was being denied by the regional center services. He was being denied by the insurance companies, the behavioral health services that the DSM and the evidence-based models were telling us that he should be receiving. And he was being denied by the school districts. Any kind of services that were in place according to what the Psychiatric Association or the Pediatric Association was recommending that he receive for help.
Do psychiatric medications come into it?
Psychiatrists, when it comes to treating children with autism, aren't looking at any of the causal issues that perhaps could be causing autism. So it's very much you have some issues with the neurochemistry of your brain, and we're going to prescribe you a medication to address either serotonin or epinephrine, dopamine issues in your brain. We're going to give you antipsychotic or a psychotropic medication, and we are going to suppress the symptomology within a child with autism. So to say that psychoactive medications are treating this as we know the cause would be a false statement. Now, is there evidence that psychoactive medications are working for these children in terms of behavioral observation? It's conflicted. We don't really know what the data shows because it's being controlled and dominated by the very people that are saying that this is autism and that it's a neurochemical impairment, and we can treat them by just providing them a drug that changes the neurochemistry in the brain. So with the emerging research and considering if we look at the biased versus the unbiased research, we absolutely know that autism is so much more than neurochemistry in the brain. And so many children are improving without the use of psychoactive medication by using biomedical interventions. So changing the diet, addressing the immune system with naturopathic, sometimes herbs or different types of vitamins and supplements, or treatments like hyperbaric oxygen chamber or IVIG. So we've got all of these different interventions now that children are vastly improving and in many cases losing their diagnosis of autism without the use of psychoactive medications.
Talk about your schools and clinics a little bit.
After all the denials had started with the school districts, the regional centers, and insurance companies, there was no hope offered to us. So I felt like I had to take it into my own hands. I had put him into schools, public schools. I had given them a chance to help him. He was not only failing at making any progress, he was coming home abused. He was coming home bruised, hair missing from being pulled out, bite marks. He was missing a lot of times on campus from running off. He was a runner. And at that particular time, there was no coverage anyway from other people. So I had to just figure it out myself and wanted to find out how I could provide his services through the insurance companies, through the regional centers, and start my own school.
And so how did that move forward?
Really quickly. It's such a journey. Oh my gosh. I still feel like I'm in a whirlwind, Because it's hard for me because the truth is I'm Dominic's mom. And so when I talk about my son, I want to cry. Mm-hmm. It's like mama bear. Like that's my baby and I want to protect him. Mm-hmm. And then I have to put on the hat of, oh wait, I'm a marriage and family therapist. I did a PhD in psychology through all of this, and I went back to USC and did a doctorate in education, and I started schools, and I started clinics. Mm. I was just trying to survive all of it. Mm. So it's like, which hat do I wear sometimes? It gets confusing, and then I just want to
Quite a journey, absolutely.
So I'll compose myself back for the film. And then figure out which hat you want me to answer from, Dominic's mom or professional.
Now, when you started these clinics and schools,
yes,
the purpose is you were trying to create clinics and schools that could actually be not denied through insurance companies, school districts, and the government.
Yes.
Basically.
Yeah.
That was the purpose in you doing that.
Right.
So
could I clarify though?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They all funnel back to the government. Mm-hmm. I've learned that. So that's part of the system now that I've learned is you've got the federal government who's the Center for Disease Control and the National Institute of Health, and then they regulate out to the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association. And then over at the federal government, you have the Federal Department of Education. Mm. And then they regulate out to the schools, that manage our children. And then you've got the Department of Disabilities, who then regulates the social services. So I love when I have a whiteboard because I can, now that I've survived the system, I could draw it all out for you, as it really does all boil down to the government and who's controlling what. And it really is psychiatry. It absolutely boils down to the psychiatrists that are operating under the American Medical Association. We figured out their boards and how they all operate. They basically jump around each other's boards, right? And they control everything that comes out in the science world through the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and then the insurance companies that provide these services to our families, and the school districts that we're sending our children to receive services through the American Disability Act, and they all know what they're doing with our children and the next generations to come by using the label autism.
Okay.
Sorry, that was just my little tangent.
Absolutely. And
We'll get back on track.
well, that was actually on track.
Okay, that was on track. Okay.
So at the peak,
Yeah.
how big was your organization? How many did you have? Multiple clinics, schools?
Yeah, so at the peak of the mental health clinics and the schools, we were servicing thousands of children. And I had 5 locations in Southern California, and then we globally expanded. I was going to Asia and Europe and the Middle East and establishing relationships with families around the world.
So you had 5 centers. Mm-hmm. How many employees? What types of resources did you have available to people?
We had about 312 employees, school teachers, speech and language therapists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, marriage and family therapists, licensed clinical social workers, neuropsychologists, and medical doctors. At the peak, I had created the entire service model for a family struggling with autism, and we had schools. So a school where children could come and receive services ages 3 years old to 22 years old. And then we also had what's called a non-public agency. So our providers go into the schools, and that was in that was 5 counties in the state of California.
Okay. And when you applied through all the clinics and the schools for insurance coverage, mm-hmm. And support from government agencies, was it approved?
No.
Okay, so you were denied all the services.
Yes.
Through the insurance companies.
I was denied through every agency. Mm-hmm. So I was denied through every agency that we went to for services, and I self-funded it in the beginning. I had inherited money from my grandmother, and I used everything I had to pay for the children's services.
Okay, and so what course of action did you take legally then?
So our legal battle started in 2002 when he was first denied services, and they continue till today in 2018. So this has been a very long journey, and the insurance companies, the regional centers, and the school districts have all been found to be accountable for the denials of services that the children were subjected to. And this is an important topic to talk about when it comes to the legalities of families with autism, because it is a intentional system of denial. And so at the peak of our clinics and our schools, we did settle a very large amount of money. In those settlement agreements, they indicate that you can't talk about the settlement agreement amounts. And some of them individually have different terms and conditions to those settlement agreements. But I can say, as the founder and the executive director of our clinics and schools, that it's a very large amount of money, and it helped benefit thousands of children in the state of California overall, because one of the results of the lawsuits was writing SB 946 and getting the denied services of behavioral therapy by insurance companies to be covered now for children with autism spectrum disorders. But the system of denials still exists. They will find ways to deny the child. For example, they'll say that even though the child has autism, if they have a diagnosis of intellectual disability, they're not going to benefit from the service, and then they'll deny them. School districts in particular are notorious for denying services. This is ongoing today. There are thousands of children in the state of California. We looked up the figures last week. It's approximately 800,000 children that are on IEPs, and most of those end up having legal situations where special education lawyers come in and you have to file due process complaints against the school districts to get them to adhere to providing the evidence-based services that their children are supposed to get within the school. They're also sued for tort claims and for violations to the American Disability Act and what we call Section 504. So this is an ongoing issue that impacts everybody because it's the people's tax dollars that are paying for a lot of these settlement agreements. They're paying for the services within the school districts. The interesting part about the law behind what the school districts and the insurance companies are engaging in is they have you sign settlement agreements so the general public doesn't learn that this is what's going on. They know that our children with autism are medically sick. They know that the children need medical services from the doctors who are ethical, who are treating our children with the services that they need, both medically, behaviorally, and academically. But it's really getting to the core of the system, the school district, the core of the insurance companies, the core of the American Medical Association and the American Psychiatric Association. And so this is huge. I mean, this is that, how do we all get together and look at what's been happening over the last 50, 60 years? See, this really is a civil rights movement. This really is a humanitarian movement, is that we need us all to band together because it's parents like me that are out there on the front line, and we're very few. Most people are scared, they're intimidated. It's very analogous to civil rights movements with, like I constantly use Brown versus the Board of Education. When you were segregating off the African American population from the Anglo-Saxon population, it was because of the DSM, and they were saying that the blacks were subspecies or subpar intellectually, and so they were saying that they could be separated from the whites in the schools. Well, they're doing the same thing to our children, is they're separating off the children with autism and saying they're a subspecies or they're subpar intellectually or behaviorally, academically, and so they need to belong over there. And so very much like Brown versus the Board of Education, the civil rights, you had your Martin Luther King and you had your Rosa Parks and you had your Malcolm X. Those are the names that we remember of that civil rights movement that stood up and said, enough is enough and we're not going to tolerate this anymore. But the rest of the population was scared. I mean, they were getting obviously murdered. They were getting physically assaulted. They were being arrested. The whole spectrum of things that were going on, and that movement is exactly what we're seeing today in the autism movement. We're seeing the same exact thing occur, is that there's very few parents that are standing up and saying, this is wrong. There's very few lawyers in our industry. The lawyers in our industry are a very small population of legal teams that are willing to put their necks out there on the line for our children. And we're here today, and we are that resource for families saying we all need to band together. You need to wake up to what's happening with the DSM. You need to pay attention to what's happening within the doctor's offices, within the school districts, within our social service department. And this does affect everybody. Every single person now knows of somebody with autism. And if you don't have a family member, you're going to have a family member, because you went from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 39 children now being impacted by autism. And it doesn't just end there. It's ADHD, it's bipolar, it's speech and language disorder, it's dyslexia. It's all these labels, all of these things that we're saying are wrong with our children. Every single person now is impacted by that, either personally, professionally. And if you are the rare few that says no, then your tax dollars are still paying for it. And so it does affect you.
Pretty inspiring. Listen, thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it so much. So informative, and honestly, you're going to help a lot of people. So, and that's the bottom line. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Hello, I'm Jamie Lynn, and thank you so much for watching our video. I'm here to help you along your journey. If you'd like to contact me, please feel free to reach out at www.hopeforautism.com. You can also reach me at www.hopeincacademy.org. And if you're interested in my #1 best-selling book, Hope for Autism, you can check that out over at Amazon. We wish you all the best on your journey, and thank you again so much for checking out our video.